Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to TEFAF Afternoons. I'm very excited. This is the first day of public programming at the fair. We had a coffee talk at 11, we had one panel at 2, and now we have this one at 4. I encourage you please to have a look at this and see what else is on for you, because I think there are many interesting things that you might like to attend. This is such a fantastic treat, and I'm so glad you're here to be part of it. We have the great honor of having a director of one of the great museums in the world with us today, and I'm absolutely thrilled. And I had the chance to speak with him briefly at the V&A in London a few months ago, which was lovely, so we're kind of know each other a tiny bit, just a tiny bit. But Thomas Marks, who is the editor of Apollo magazine, knows him a lot better, and I suspect that this is going to be an extremely interesting conversation. Thank you. Oh, one more thing, sorry. We're being live streamed on Facebook, and you can see it afterwards on Facebook or recommend it to your friends. And then once we go through the final edit, it's up on the website permanently, okay? So thank you so very much for being here. Enjoy.
Thank you very much, Linda. And thanks for that introduction. I'm delighted to be here with Tristram Hunt, and we'll introduce him in a minute. He tells me his real reason for being in New York is that he's going to the Met Gala on Monday, and I said he's not going to get away with wearing this blue suit, and he's a headdress.
I feel under a great deal of pressure.
But Tristram, it's great that you've come to do this interview. And I'm going to give you a little introduction, and then we're going to introduce the V&A with a short video. Tristram, as a museum director, I think has taken a really interesting path into museology and museums. He was an academic, historian, published several books on Victorian cities, on a biography of Friedrich Engels, a book more recently about imperial cities, Victorian cities. He was a politician, and how did that go?
That was, well, I don't know, it seems to have gone even worse since I left. That's my analysis.
Well, there's always room to go back, or time to go back. But Tristram was an MP for the Stoke-on-Trent Central seat, really important seat in terms of its history and the link there, and I'm sure we'll come on to that it's a place where the potteries were from the 18th century and through the 19th century and still today. And that's something you've been very interested in. And you were the Shadow Secretary of State for Education as well. So, I mean, a serious political career. And then in 2017, you announced that you were taking up the job as a director of the V&A. And before I let you talk about that, well, I'm really glad I pay all my taxes so you can make such nice music videos. Tristram, let me start off by asking you about that route into museum directorship. And, I mean, does it still feel like it's been a strange or different trajectory from academia through politics into the museum?
My background as a historian was in mid-19th century urban cultural history of Victorian Britain. And so joining the V&A felt intensely familiar in terms of the history which I had studied. The difference between a historian and a museum director is that as a historian, you tend to look for the narrative, you tend to look for the arc, you tend to look for the explanation. And in the museum, you start with the object and the power and the wonder of the object. In a sense, you move out from the object. And as a historian, you put the object you start by initially thinking, where does that fit within the broader story? So learning to begin with the artifact and the house collection and the object was a big change in thinking. And then moving from being a politician where, as Thomas said, I was very privileged to represent Stoke-on-Trent, which is the potteries, it's the Midlands heart of the ceramic industry, where we had a big fight in 2013-14 to save the Wedgwood collection, which was going to be dispersed and sold around the world. Moving from politics to museum was very interesting in terms of thinking about the past, because what you discover when you work at the Palace of Westminster is that there's this very cloying sense of historicism, like a very powerful sense of nostalgia. And so even at the V&A, I'm surrounded by 5,000 years of history telling the story of human creativity, but there's no nostalgia in the museum. There's this really rigorous, critical, energetic engagement with the nature of the past and the contemporary meaning of the past. And so I think in politics, we wallow a lot in the past, particularly in Britain at the moment. Whereas in museums, we're having this wrestle with the past. We're having this conversation with the past, which feels much more energizing.
I'm just going to interrupt the flow of the questions that I prepared, because we asked in Apollo last month whether the Houses of Parliament, this wonderful Pugin building, should be turned into a museum. Do you think it should become a museum?
I don't think it should become a museum, because I think there is as soon as you turn it into a museum, it will lose its sensibility. And actually what keeps the aura of the building is the functioning of democracy within it. That said, I don't like being in that building that much. I find it very enervating. I find it there's a bad karma to large parts of that building. And what would be good would be, I think, not just a full kind of conservation operation, but you do want, I think now, some form of contemporary intervention within the restoration program. I think a
general election, I think it's called.
Well, there could be that as well. Exactly. I think as a country we kind of need it.
But moving from, that point, you were presumably contemplating leaving politics, and the job came up. Tragically, the former director, the former director had left, in fact, but later Martin Roth died quite soon afterwards. Just tell me, when you went into the meetings with the trustees, Nicholas Coleridge was the chairman of trustees, what was your elevator pitch going in to take the V&A directorship?
It was primarily about education and the importance of education within museums. That the V&A began in the design school movement of the 1830s and 40s, and unlike many other museums, it was not a place to sort of wander in the sublime and retreat from the world. It always had this quite sort of functional purpose in teaching art and design. Prince Albert called it a central storehouse of art and science to encourage creativity, and we have this almost crippling problem in the UK at the moment of the stripping out of creativity within our education system. So for a museum like the V&A, born of the design school movement, it seemed to me to have this absolutely pivotal role at a pivotal moment to think about education. So I made a strong pitch around education. We've begun that, helping to teach design right around the country, professional development of design teachers. But I also made the case, I think, that the V&A, under great directors like Mark Jones, my predecessor, great chairs, and we've got Paul Ruddock with us here this afternoon, had transformed itself. But within the popular imagination and public consciousness, I felt there was another step to go. I felt its voice could be further amplified, and hopefully its profile has also been raised in the last 2 years.
I'm definitely going to move on to moving backwards to Henry Cole, the foundation of the South Kensington Museum. But just to talk one more question about moving into the museum for you, and you mentioned the different approach to objects. Just can you say a bit about how you've been discovering the collection and some of the challenges of working with curators and thinking about actual objects and conservation and the stewardship of them? It's very different from what you were working on before.
It's very different. I mean, the wonder of my post is that when a meeting is cancelled, I can go into the glass galleries or the ceramics galleries or go and look at the Donatellos or go and look at the Turners, and that is the profound privilege. And understanding the V&A collection, it's 17 national collections in one building, from the art of photography to textiles, ceramics, glass, sculpture. And so there's just a never-ending understanding of the collections. But I think what I've sort of wrestled with then is that those broader obligations to the collection around conservation and science and restoration and the handling and understanding that. And as ever, I'm trying to kind of take some of this out of me, but I'm not quite a politician in a hurry, but you always want to do more quickly. And understanding some of the museum rhythms are there. Now, one shouldn't fall into all of those and one should challenge those, but there are also an understanding of the systems of how museums function and operate, which sometimes is incredibly fast-moving and innovative and dynamic, and at other times you do not understand why this picture could not have been put up within 9 months.
But do you think you have a mandate coming in as a new director to a massive national museum like that to also be a bit of a disruptor, coming in from outside curatorial work and that side of museums?
Yes and no. I think I also had to show the curatorial body and all those members of staff who aren't curators but love the collection, understand the collection and cherish the collection, that coming from a non-museum background as a historian and a politician, that I had great respect and growing understanding for what the museum did and what it was for. And there's this sort of classic notion, you've got this 18-month window, and if you don't achieve then, you're never going to achieve it. I don't believe that. If you set yourself there and say, well, I hope to be in this job for a good period of time, and actually, a sustained program of change is what I want to achieve. I also inherited a museum in great shape. And that's, as I said to the trustees in my interview, that has not always been the case at the V&A. There's normally this rather dangerous cycle within the museum. But actually, I was very privileged to inherit a museum in really strong shape.
Well, there's obviously been the future plan, and a lot of galleries have been refurbished over the last 15 years. I think I read 85% of the galleries, in fact. But let's talk about one of the projects that you inherited, I suppose, but I know is very close to your heart and feeling for the 19th century. So we're going to talk a bit about the cast courts. And I mean, how far does this project, well, first of all, perhaps you might explain to the audience who might not know the cast courts what their significance is, but also how that fits into the V&A today, mirroring and remembering the mission of the founding by Prince Albert, Henry Cole, and some of those other really enlightened figures of the 19th century.
So the cast courts, and we've got the Western cast court here, and then there's the Ruddock family cast court on the other side, are really one of the kind of the most important spaces within the museum. Henry Cole, who was the first director of the Victoria and Albert Museum, had this great passion for democratizing culture, and the growth of reproductive technologies, plaster cast, electrotype and photography in the 1850s and 1860s allowed working people in London to see Michelangelo's David. They could never go to Florence in their wildest imaginations, but here Florence was coming to them, or Pisano's pulpit. And so the notion of democratizing, and one of the tragedies is actually there was also lots of South Asian plaster casts as well, which were then destroyed or dispersed in the interwar periods, of democratizing high culture for the people through technology. And so it's a very V&A story about democracy, because the V&A was also the first to introduce gas lighting to the museum so people could come after work to see the collections, first to introduce a restaurant and a cafe so you could have an enjoyable time at the museum. But also this really interesting mix of modernism and historicism. What Cole liked was taking the most advanced technologies of the day and understanding the past through it. And why we're particularly excited by these galleries at the moment is that all of the conversations today about digital scanning, about 3D reproduction, about the ownership of kind of metadata surrounding scans, Cole was wrestling with all of this in the 1850s and 60s, and he created in 1867 this agreement between all the crown princes of Europe to share their collections for the purpose of plaster casts. So for us at the V&A, these sublime spaces, as everyone called them at the time, are really, really significant.
I mean, these historicist places as well, and that sense of preserving, although in a collage of the past and of art history and of global art history as well. But would it be fair to say that in some way the cast courts are almost the most contemporary spaces of the V&A?
They feel incredibly contemporary, but also almost this kind of sketch way you think about them, that you're herding them together. And they haven't changed since. I mean, the other cast court you see, it has the same items it had in 1872. And yet, next to it, we have 3D scans of the Palmyra Arch. We have some of the latest technology which has been used in the Middle East for the preservation and restoration of artifacts. So they do absolutely feel incredibly contemporary and energetic.
And this thing about, for Henry Cole, for the South Kensington Museum, I mean, improving design was a moral and social principle. And you talk about the museum still being able to, or increasingly again, being able to train designers. Can you say a little bit more about how that can work in practice? Because obviously you can go into the museum and on the ground floor you can be floods of people trying to look at the highlights and so on. How actually can a museum today really improve design and its quality?
40% of visitors to the V&A describe themselves as from the creative industries. So this notion of the museum as a storehouse, as a treasury for inspiration, just through the presentation of the artifacts remains important. And when you talk in the UK to Thomas Heatherwick or Anya High-Marsh or Norman Foster, just coming to the V&A for free, 7 days a week, to drop in, to see the collection as a source of inspiration remains incredibly powerful. So there's that role, just almost kind of being there and keeping the collections open and free. And then there's also the incredibly important education work. And my passion is to share this collection more widely around the country. So we've instituted a program called Design Lab Nation, which works across 6 cities and towns across non-metropolitan England, in former industrial centres where we know design teaching's in difficulties, where we know communities are going to struggle to get their kids to come to the museum. So we're taking the artefacts out to local museums, working with local schools, training design teachers, and using our artifacts to inspire art and design. And we're going to kind of be doing more on this in the coming years.
And those are actual artifacts or actually 3D reproductions
so
as well?
So the teachers come to the museum in South Kensington and we say, what would you like to borrow for your course? And they say, well, I'd like to borrow Raphael's cartoons. And we say, well, if you can't have Raphael's cartoons, is there anything else we can offer? And then we get to, and so whether it's the Potteries Museum in Stoke, whether it's the Textile Museum in Blackburn, in Lancashire, whether it's the Glass Museum up in Sunderland, we're then sending some great works out there which hopefully provide the kind of kindling and inspiration for people to be inspired. And again, the V&A has had this long history because it had what was called the circulation department, which began in the early 1900s, which had this very conscious idea of circulating its artifacts right across the country. And I think if you look at the collections at the V&A, which emerged, many of them from the 1851 Great Exhibition, well, those come from Sheffield and Sunderland and Blackburn and Stoke. Our collections are born from those parts of the country. So in a sense, returning the obligation and the favour back there seems an important thing to do.
And we'll talk about other ways that's happening a bit later on. But since you mentioned the Great Exhibition, since we've mentioned in passing Prince Albert, the V&A has, since 1899, I think, had in its title the names of the monarchs, Victoria
Should we see
and
the
Albert.
coronet? Sorry, you were going to go
press
there.
the button.
Sorry.
Yeah. But I wanted to ask you, I mean, in 2019, what's the sort of role of, and especially that this is the bicentenary year of both Victoria and Albert, what is the role of those names above the door of the museum and on all the marketing and the fact of monarchy as an inspiration for this museum?
First of all, let me just say something about this.
Yeah.
So this is the diamond and sapphire coronet which Prince Albert designed for Queen Victoria for their wedding. And when Albert died, then it became a great symbol for Victoria of her loss. It's on the great Winterhalter portraits of Queen Victoria, and we managed to acquire it recently through a very generous gift from William Bollinger, and now it sits at the heart of our jewellery gallery. It's our kind of eternal flame in the museum on, as Thomas said, the 200th anniversary of the birth of Victoria and Albert. And I think there was quite an open conversation 10, 15 years ago, should the names Victoria and Albert be sort of dropped from the museum. And obviously there was a kind of shift in branding. We describe ourselves more as V&A than the Victoria and Albert. But I'm very proud of the name Victoria and Albert because you have to understand the mission. And Albert's mission was about manufacturing, design, technology, democracy, open access, all of these components. And so I think what you do in any institution is you go back to its founding mission and purpose and see how that makes sense today. And I can see all sorts of relevance in that. And I also think it's a weird thing in the UK that we were created by the Crown. We weren't created by the government or Henry Tate or there's a different lineage to us, which also gives us a degree of kind of independence and a degree of a kind of different story to us. And on our new Exhibition Road entrance, where we have these new gates, we've put, and these were only opened 2 years ago. You saw the picture of the Duchess opening them. We put the crown up there. And we didn't need to put the crown back up on some of our artifacts in 2016, but we felt it was important to the institution.
And I suppose also, this moment of Albert being a foreign emigre to, a rather privileged emigre to Britain. And the other German intellectuals who were there with him, Gustav Wagen and Gottfried Semper and people like that in a sense this already was an international museum by the nature of its very founding.
I think that's so important. The origins of the museum are British, European and extra-European. There's clearly a British story to the establishment, but Albert of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha was from the European continent, brings with him these continental refugees from the 1848, 1849 revolutions, one of whom, Gottfried Semper, has this wonderful phrase. He describes museums as the true teachers of a free people, that they have, again, this civic role. And then within the collection, we also have our East India Company collection, our South Asia collection. So from the beginning, there's this international component to what the V&A is about. And I think, as you say, particularly now with, sort of ugly currents of chauvinism and nationalism having a consciously British institution with these European and extra-European lineages is really significant.
It's a sort of meta question, because the question is the same, but does that mean that you find yourself answering a lot of questions about imperialism?
Yes, yeah. I mean, we are an institution also born of the imperial and the colonial moment. So all of the conversations today around kind of decolonization and the responsibilities of institutions like the V&A to the collections we hold is I mean, the range and extent of our collections, which are, as it were, disputed, are markedly less than some other institutions, but it absolutely affects us, and more than affects us, we need to be engaged in that conversation.
We'll get on to that, because I want to talk as well about one way in which you aren't, as it were, London-centric, and one way in which you have obviously spread the wings of the V&A, or the V&A has spread its wings, is with its collaborations with V&A Dundee, with the plans. Well, sure, it's still London, but it's East London for V&A East, and even with the Design Society in China. Is it Shenzhen?
Yeah.
So let me ask you first of all about what the significance of V&A Dundee has been for the V&A, not so much as a brand, but as a museum, and as a museum that has a very promising future.
So this is V&A Dundee on the banks of the Tay, designed by the Japanese architect Kengo Kuma, opened in September last year. 500,000 visitors within 6 months in a city of 150,000. So everyone's had to come 3 times at least, and we keep counting. And it's a museum of Scottish design. It tells the story of Scotland's influence on design around the world and vice versa. In a city facing big challenges in terms of low income, unemployment, post-industrial strategy, and to have a really conscious investment in culture has been profound. We've learned a great deal about it as an institution, because for a long time it had neither a collection nor a building, yet it was much more invested as a cultural institution in the lives and communities of local people than many institutions with very large buildings and very large collections. So we've learned in terms of the development of it. And it goes back, interestingly, to that, in a sense, that conversation around monarchy and identity, that, you know, the V&A in South Kensington is in England. There are, you know, growing tensions, but it's more febrile than has been in past between Scotland and England. Having a UK institution in Dundee, you know, we share the same monarchs and other things, is an important cultural signifier. It's not a franchise, it's not an outpost. We, the V&A, we're only 20% of the board, even though it's called V&A Dundee. So it's a partnership with the city council, local universities, the government. So we think it's a really kind of enterprising way of approaching this.
So why is that you have the branding, but you only have 20% of the management responsibilities, or?
Yes, I mean it's you know, built by Dundee City Council, supported by the Scottish government. We were, as many institutions were, rightly under, and we have the chairman here, might want to say more about its inspiration, were under pressure to ensure that our collection went as widely as possible. But what we didn't want was exactly that, a series of franchises. What we wanted to do was create a different model which was invested in the area. So the director of V&A Dundee answers to me only as one of 5 trustees. I'm not, as it were, the line manager, it's the chair of trustees there. So it was a different model of doing it. But we brought our brand strength. The collection is the V&A's and it sits there. And we brought our curatorial strength to it. And hopefully, at the moment into the future, it's working well.
I mean, there's so much V&A programming these days. I get almost as many emails from the V&A as I do from Gagosian.
Good. That's our...
V&A East is something that we should talk about. Obviously, this is on the former London Olympic Park. It seemed to me that it was always a project that was slightly slow in getting going. I mean, it's something that people have been talking about for 10 years. And maybe it was slow in getting going because it sort of had Boris Johnson's imprimatur over it in the initial moments when he was Mayor of London. But talk to me now about, Why is this going to really change what the V&A can do with its collections?
This is a really exciting initiative in the East End of London on the Olympic Park, where the 2012 Olympics was held. And I think, without sort of banging the drum, I think London's done really well with its Olympic legacy. You see so many of those kind of wastelands after the Olympics. And actually in London, the housing, the cultural infrastructure, the development has been taken really seriously and done well. The next step is a project called East Bank, which is a collaboration between Sadler's Wells Dance Company, the BBC, the London College of Fashion, and ourselves with the Smithsonian Institution. I've just been up in Washington with colleagues there. So on the left, you can see the Waterfront Museum, which the V&A will be co-curating with the Smithsonian. So we are being able to draw in some of the great collections from the Native American collection, Air and Space, African American art, right across the Smithsonian to bring it to East London. And East London is well, the population at the moment is 65% black and minority ethnic. It's the youngest, it's the most diverse, it's the fastest growing. And with the best will in the world, we often find it difficult to bring those communities to South Kensington. And so we're going there. And the ambition for the Waterfront Museum is to have a really strong thematic approach to programming. So rather than that kind of encyclopedic vision, the pursuance of arguments through the collections about design movements, about creativity, whilst also drawing on big kind of polemical questions of the day. And we're thinking of, I can't.
It'll be free as well, or
free entry, absolutely, with new, with paid for exhibitions on the kind of English model, and it's very exciting. I would say bringing together some of the V&A skill in exhibition and design with the kind of great bench strength of the Smithsonian curatorial understanding and collections. So we're very excited by this. And then on the right, what you see is the design from Liz Diller for our new Collections and Research Centre. And what this is an attempt to kind of fuse that traditional divide between storage and gallery. We are being moved out of our reserve storage facility in West London at the moment. And so on the same Olympic site, what we're doing is creating a massive open access V&A vault so that you will be able to wander through the reserve collection of the V&A. The problem with Liz Diller's imagery is it all seems we have the world's largest collection of sculptural busts. Actually, our sculptural bust collection is not as extensive as Liz thinks. But what we'll also be doing there is, in a very V&A way, is rebuilding some of our great historic rooms. The V&A, rooms like this, has always kind of taken salvage from areas under destruction. And we have, every day, we have an American visitor who comes to South Kensington and says, where can I see the Kaufman office designed by Frank Lloyd Wright, and you can't because it's all in bits at the moment, and we're going to rebuild that. So we're going to rebuild kind of 10 great historic rooms within this collection, and so there'll be these clearings in the forest where you can discover these moments. So it's a big project.
And I understand the geographical argument about a more deprived area of London and the boroughs around there. Does it keep you awake at night thinking not so much how you're going to fundraise for the project, but actually how you're going to pay to keep it going? Will you have more government grant in aid, or do you need more private funding for it? These are huge projects to keep. I mean, you have to expand your staff and you name it.
I mean, it does. I mean, those kind of things keep me. I mean, most things keep me awake on that front. But no, we will get. We will receive extra grant and aid for the running of the museum. We were invited by the government to go there, so we said yes, but we will need support for it, and we'll also need, absolutely, philanthropic support. But I think the other point to make about this is that East London was always the arrival point in the UK. I mean, this was the arrival point for post-war Caribbean community, before that for the Jewish community, after that for a Bengali, Bangladeshi heritage community. And as a result, it's a place of great enterprise, but also a place of great designing and making. This is a kind of making community. So, what is the V&A about? This is about supporting makers and designers and creatives. This is a landscape full of creativity, quite an intimate sphere.
You already have another museum in East London, the Museum of Childhood
Absolutely.
in Bethnal Green.
Absolutely.
I think one thing that's interesting about that museum, as a tangent, but when Richard Wallace, who obviously left his and the Marquis of Hertford, his father's collection to the nation, and it went into Manchester House in Manchester Square, but he had put those works on in that museum in Bethnal Green.
Yes.
And it must have been one of the most popular exhibitions of the 19th century. And there you are. It's one of those fallacies that things that are gold can't go into deprived areas or something like that.
And actually, so the museum in East London, which has been there since 1872, and again in a very disadvantaged part of the capital, it was where the V&A used to put its most contemporary artifacts in communities that you wouldn't think would actually respond to that, and they responded incredibly positively.
Just before we open some questions, one other topic I really want to discuss is that, perhaps it's your political experience, but I feel like you've stepped into the role of being a museum director and been willing and not afraid to make public statements. Your predecessor sometimes expressed to me and also to other journalists the feeling that he was sometimes corralled into not being able to say things and penned in because of his role as a museum director, reporting to some degree to the Department for Culture. Do you think it is part of your role to be able to speak out as a museum director? I mean, some of the things that you've said, or do you think that because you were a politician and a public figure, whatever you say gets reported on anyway?
I think you can't comment on party politics. I mean, you can't, and particularly someone from my background, and there are quite rightly sort of strict rules about those who take public money, as I do, and I answer to both my chair of trustees, but also to the Department for Culture. So I do have to be objective and take that kind of seriously. But I think you do also want cultural leaders, whether it's in museums or galleries or the BBC or journalism, to be able to contribute to the public discourse, and whether that's around issues of relations with Europe, whether that's about our kind of colonial past, whether that's questions of, I'm a big supporter, although, yes, I probably shouldn't say much more, but I'm a supporter of a hotel tax in London to support, you go to every other city around the world and there's a hotel tax to support cultural infrastructure.
Well, it's okay if it gets invested in cultural
yeah,
infrastructure.
that is
I mean, this is the argument in Rome at the moment, that it just disappears and things aren't improving.
Yeah.
So, but I mean, do you think that those ideas, I mean, do you feel like you can lobby, and who are you lobbying? You're lobbying public opinion, or you're actually lobbying government?
I don't think I can lobby to change. I mean, there are kind of areas where the sort of, the museums come together and behind the scenes seek to assuage public opinion. But before, as it were, you get to a situation where government has decided X or Y, I think you can help to shape the debate. And I think, there are political questions, and whether it's kind of mass tourism, whether it's cultural appropriation, these are issues which we're kind of wrestling with in the public realm, and those voices in museums, if they're, whether they're publicly funded or not, should, I think, probably contribute to that.
Do you think, I mean, museums, perhaps more than 10, 15 years ago, seem to be constantly on the defensive at the moment, on the defensive about who their funders are, on the defensive about who sponsored them, on the defensive about where objects have come from, why there isn't yet enough diversity in their collections and in their audiences. I mean, that must be pretty tiring, always being on the defensive, or do you have to step forward and make a play to change the debate yourself?
But also, I mean, it is febrile and it is political, but I also sometimes don't think my colleagues understand the extent of their own authority and the power of their own positions to help shape and manage this. And if you are always on defensive, if you are always, having to run your words through your press office and other things, then you're not helping to kind of shape the contours of that. And the other thing is, I've having been in politics, some colleagues can get very worried by, small articles appearing on page 19 of the art newspaper I say, only when you've been denounced 3 days in a row on the front page of a tabloid should you begin to worry. At that point, that's the kind of tipping point. Prior to that, I think you can sort of manage these things.
Have you ever imagined what the headlines would be on the front of the Sun?
Yeah, it's always crisis at the museum. That's always, we're always, every museum director is heading towards that at some point.
But, I mean, a lot of your fellow national museums, the Tate and the National Portrait Gallery, have put out statements saying they're not going to take any more funding from the Sackler family, at least the branch which has been related to Purdue Pharma. And your new courtyard, opened, 2014, is the Sackler Courtyard.
Yes.
Is this problematic for you in terms of having that name?
And Teresa Sackler is one of our trustees, and we're grateful to her service. I mean, our position now is that the Sackler family have said they're not going to be funding any more cultural activities or arts activities into the future, and we respect that, but we're not taking any names down.
In terms of things that are historical, you also have, you spoke about the Magdala artifacts from Ethiopia, a display of, looking at the provenance research. It's something that clearly is very important to you and to your colleagues at the V&A. You've also, in the context of that, talked about museums as safe spaces to explore difficult ideas. And I thought maybe we could end, before opening to some questions from the audience, with just explaining what you mean by that.
I think it's very, very important in an era which is kind of so febrile in terms of politics and so divided, both here in the States and in the UK, that to go back to that kind of Gottfried Semper idea of museums as true teachers of a free people, to have civic spaces where difficult ideas can be explored and reflected upon in a kind of respectful manner. And museums can help to provide that kind of public sphere. I think what we also do is provide stories of multiculturalism and exchange and interaction adaptation through our collections. And in an era of chauvinism and populism and nationalism, actually telling the complicated stories of how traditions and identities and peoples share from one another over time, which is what our collections are about, seems to me, very, very important. And finally, I'm a strong, and this is where it gets a really interesting tension about opening up museums in terms of kind of co-curation, but also a strong belief in the role of the curator, because again, in an era of sort of, Facebook echo chambers and fake news and social media, museums as trusted institutions to provide, clearly researched, well-sourced accounts of the history of objects or the accounts of history, of displaying that knowledge and not being uncomfortable about saying knowledge is important, expertise is important, and museums are places within which it's housed, again, seems to me something we should be confident about doing. We shouldn't be arrogant about this. We have mistakes. No museum is neutral. We kind of get all that. But in an era when we're so obsessed by the merits and virtues of relativism, having places of knowledge and understanding where curators work over decades to understand the nature of objects and the history of artifacts, we need to make the case for that. And so you bring together people here in our Globe, in our Europe galleries, a very kind of Enlightenment idea, having really interesting and provocative and powerful but respectful discussions, often about complicated and quite divisive issues. And I think so rather than museums in crisis, actually museums, more people are coming to museums, they're looking online, they're coming through the doors, museums are leading debates, and actually they seem to be more important today.
If you were going to choose one object that you would run a session like this on as the centerpiece from the collection, what would it be?
We have It's not quite as good as the one in the Rijksmuseum, but we have a superb Dutch Delftware tulip holder in the shape of a Chinese pagoda. So here you have a story of the Dutch imitating sort of blue and white ware from China, itself taking cobalt from Iran to create this design, which then comes to Holland, which is then designed in the shape of a Chinese pagoda to house a national flower which originates in Iran. And it seems to me in one in one object you've got an account, which then Queen Mary introduces to Britain in the 1680s. And so everyone then in Britain in the 18th century obviously wants a Delftware tulip pagoda.
With the world in the museum and the world of the museum. I'm going to open the floor to some questions, if that's okay with you, Tristram. We've got about 10 minutes. There's a gentleman over here. There's a microphone just on its way to you behind.
Thanks very much. Wonderful conversation. I want to take you back to the moment when you were talking about the cast courts, and you both totally happily agreed that this was the most contemporary space in the museum. Please tell us, in which ways is it contemporary? Can you elaborate that for us?
I think it's contemporary in terms of the issues that it throws up, because one of the challenges we're dealing with now, and as a museum, is in a sense rights over the reproduction of imagery and artifacts. Who owns this? Should we have the right to reproduce today great works from museums? I mean, so the Met and the Rijksmuseum have allowed open access to their collections at kind of high resolution online, but not open access in terms of entry, because you have to pay $25. We don't have open access to the full
No, I have to
imagery.
pay £100 every time I print
good.
that image in Apollo.
But I think it's the question of, in a digital society where there is universal access to imagery, what are the kind of socio-political questions and cultural questions connected to that? And the big kind of case connected to this was the hacking Nefertiti. So an artist goes in and scans the Nefertiti in Berlin, and then uploads the imagery of Nefertiti online for everyone to have access to and play with. Now, is that, what does, who owns Nefertiti at that point, and who should own it, given that, as it were, it certainly wasn't originally made in Germany. And then again, it becomes very interesting with the Smithsonian, for example. So the Smithsonian have handed back a lot of their Native American artifacts to tribal communities, and have produced 3D reproductions of those. Is that right? When obviously it's the kind of the religious sanctity associated with the originality relative to the reproduction, and if they uploaded the data of those reproductions, could anyone with a 3D printer themselves print something like this? So I think in the kind of digital world we exist in, some of the issues which the cast courts throw up is what makes it modern.
And I'm not going to answer it. I just asked the question as a leading question to see what he would say. There's a lady here.
Yes. So thank you so much. If I spent time in the National Art Library and V&A, I've almost as much time as I spent at the Met and at the Frick. So thank you for providing that access. But my question is, as you know, the V&A, or the South Kensington Museum, was the really inspiration for so many American museums when they were founded in the 1870s and thereafter. And in fact, many of them started with cast collections, which they've all more or less sold. Is there a museum in America that you see as an equivalent to the V&A, or what advice would you give those? I mean, the Cooper Hewitt really is not exactly like the V&A. There really is no equivalent in the States, but I think that we could learn a lot from what the V&A is doing in the UK.
I wouldn't dare to give advice to colleagues because I think British museum directors come to America and are kind of we're bowled over by the great generosity of the philanthropic community in America and their contributions to these museums, the great exhibitions, the community work, etc., etc. I think clearly in Philadelphia there's a very strong connection to the V&A. I think in San Francisco, the De Young has elements of, the other one, the
Museum of Fine Arts?
The Legion of Honor has connections to the V&A and the Cooper Hewitt as part of the Smithsonian. But there is, I think you're right, there's a particularity around the V&A, which then you can see in the MAC in Vienna, which obviously has a much greater kind of resonance and collection. And that, again, was the European story, that from the V&A, partly because of Albert and Albert's vision, you see the transference of that idea across the European continent. And it's, you wouldn't sort of, if you're starting a museum today, as it were, you wouldn't start with 17 national collections in one, which is the great strength, but also the challenge.
Because it is also a place of anomalies, and to a degree, the painting collection, which is a wonderful painting collection, when you stumble across it and you think, gosh, the V&A is a museum that you can go to day after day, year on year, and still find whole collections that you didn't know existed, right?
And the most embarrassing thing is when you go to an exhibition in someone else's museum and you go, oh, that's interesting, that's a nice piece. And you realize it's from the V&A. This is an embarrassing moment.
Is there another question? John?
Yes. My question is the reasoning at this point. My question is the reasoning at this point for free admission for non-British visitors. The Met, as you just said, it's not voluntary anymore. You pay, and most major museums in the world, there are a few exceptions, you pay. Well, why does you feel that the non-British shouldn't pay as well as the British?
The kind of the crude answer is that because we're a national museum, we're subject to government policy, and it's the policy of the government that there should be free entry to national museums, and we get 50% of our funding from the UK government, and that is, in a sense, that supports the policy of free entry. I think if that was markedly reduced, which at times it's under threat of, our trustees, who have a legal obligation to care for the collection, would be asking some difficult questions about how they could do that. But for the V&A, because our kind of numbers, 3-4 million visitors are healthy, our business model works is that you don't pay when you come in, but you pay at the shop or the cafe or the exhibition, or in some. So we are in a very lucky position because the quality of our offer in retail and catering and exhibition, that in a sense we get a very strong income stream from that. And if you do introduce charging, your numbers drop by 50%. And so, we're at a situation where, and it's very lucky, there are other museums in the UK, particularly regional museums with free entry, who are really struggling with that.
The late Edmund Capon, great museum director in Australia, who passed away a couple of months ago, who used to say, pay to make them leave. That's, you've got to find ways to make sure they open their wallet to get out of the museum.
Yes, exactly.
Exit through the gift shop. Do we have time for one more question? The lady in the penultimate row.
Thank you very much. Full disclosure, I work at the Met, but I'm actually really interested in hearing, because unlike the Met, the V&A has this strong tradition of research and a whole division dedicated to research in addition to curatorial. And I wondered if you could speak to that kind of coexistence between these two branches of the V&A and how it works and what are the strengths and perhaps also the weaknesses of that model?
I think the research department, which has been a very, very important part of the V&A for a long time, partly because also our connection with the Royal College of Art and the education, the kind of higher educational component we had. Thanks to a gift from the Mellon Foundation, we now have a kind of bolstered research facility, which is the Research Institute, and it's a challenge sometimes in that on the one hand you want kind of blue skies academic research because out of that comes the great work. On the other hand, as a sort of director, you're thinking, well, how can this, not in a very kind of functional way benefit the exhibition next year, but what are the strands that we're working on in the coming 5 to 7 years? So when we appoint fellows, when we appoint joint scholarships, when we appoint PhDs, we are beginning to ensure that the work of the Research Institute connects to the broader strategic objectives of the museum. If I'm honest, I will be, what you've seen in the UK in the last 10 years is that thanks to the introduction of tuition fees, the research strength and capacity of university departments has grown, I don't know what you think, Thomas, markedly compared to museums. And were we to seek to be able to kind of bulk up to the same degree as some university departments, that would be a really significant investment that, frankly, we couldn't afford at the moment.
I mean, increased collaborations between universities and museums is probably actually a conversation for another day.
I'm just getting going.
Well, you have to come back for the other fair the next fair in October. It remains for me to ask the question that I've just been daydreaming about, which is, what are you going to wear for the Met Gala? No, Tristram Hunt, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon.
I think we can all just spend time dreaming about that also. I think that leaves a very strong visual for us. Thank you so much for attending. Please come back, join us for other panels throughout next Tuesday morning. It's been a delight to have both of you here again, and enjoy the fair for the rest of the afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.